If you've ever tried to set up a home theater or a serious music corner and the sound just feels thin, muffled, or like it's coming from a wall rather than the speaker itself, you know how frustrating that can be. You've probably spent hours tweaking placement, swapping cables, maybe even adding cheap subwoofers, only to get the same lackluster bass and scattered imaging that makes you wonder if you'll ever get that immersive feel you heard on a live concert. The problem isn't your ears, it's the speaker's ability to turn a room into a coherent sound field, and that's exactly where the KEF Q11 Meta Floorstanding speaker steps in. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. What makes the Q11 different is how it handles the drivers. KEF's 12th Generation Uni-Q driver is positioned right at the center of the cabinet, allowing a single-point source to emanate sound across the entire spectrum. In practice, that means when you're watching a movie and a helicopter flies overhead, the whirring noise doesn't seem to jump from left to right, it stays anchored, giving you a stable, realistic scene. Similarly, if you're listening to a jazz trio, the piano's sustain stays smooth and the cymbals retain their crisp articulation without blurring into the drums, even when the speakers are placed a few feet apart on a modest floor. Another benefit that shows up in everyday use is the way KEF's proprietary Meta material, a woven glass fiber lattice, helps calm unwanted resonances inside the cabinet. For a typical living room setup, those resonances can turn tight bass into a boomy mess, making movies sound like a roller coaster ride rather than the subtle rumble you expect from a blockbuster. With the Q11's internal damping, the bass remains deep but controlled, so you can crank up the volume for an action scene without worrying about rattling the walls. I tried it with a big SCIFI soundtrack, and the low end held its ground without turning the room into a low-frequency swamp. Design is another area where the Q11 quietly shines. Its minimalist white finish doesn't scream for attention, yet the cabinet's geometry is purpose-built to reduce diffraction, which means the sound stays consistent whether you're sitting straight on, off-axis, or even on a couch that's a little deeper than usual. I placed one speaker near a window and the other against a bookshelf, and the imaging stayed spot-on across the entire listening zone. That kind of flexibility is great for people who have to work with irregular space, no need to rearrange furniture just to get a decent stereo image. The hybrid bass driver design also brings a practical perk for those who like to mix music at home. The larger, low-frequency driver handles the deep notes while a secondary driver fills in the mid-bass, creating a smoother transition that keeps vocal lines clear and drums tight. When I ran a quick mix of a pop track, the kick drum stayed punchy but never overpowered the vocal, something that can be a headache with cheaper floor standers that either push too much bass or lack definition. Lastly, the refined crossover that sits between the drivers does the job of blending frequencies without creating noticeable gaps or peaks. In a real-world scenario, that translates to a more natural listening experience. When you switch from a podcast to a high-energy rock song, the transition feels seamless, without that thin-to-muddy dip you sometimes hear with less sophisticated speakers. Now, a quick rundown of what I liked and what could be better. The first thing that stood out for me was the clarity across the whole range, from the whisper-soft highs of an acoustic guitar to the thunderous lows of a film score, everything stayed articulate. Second, the aesthetic fits nicely into modern interiors, the white chassis looks sleek without clashing with other decor. Third, the speakers are surprisingly easy to set up. You don't need a massive amplifier to get good performance, which is a relief if you're not a hi-fi nerd. On the downside, the price point is higher than the average floor-standing speaker you might find on a discount site, so they're not the best choice if you're on a tight budget. Also, because the cabinet is relatively tall, you need a ceiling height that can accommodate them comfortably, otherwise you might end up with a cramped look in a low-ceiling room. All in all, the KEF Q11 Meta floor-standing speakers manage to turn a typical living room listening space into something that feels more like a dedicated listening room, delivering precise imaging, controlled bass, and a clean, modern look. If you've been battling with thin sound or chasing that live feel that never quite lands, these speakers give you a solid path forward without demanding a full-blown studio setup. Thanks for hanging out, and remember the link is below if you want to see more specs or grab a pair.